There is something about railroading that fascinates people, young and old. Enormous train engines pulling hundreds of freight cars across the country. And there is only one real-life icon that could signify the life and times of America's romantic railroad era. This is the true story of the infamous Tennessee railroad engineer, Casey Jones, as told by S.E. Schlotzer. Casey Jones, that heroic railroad engineer of the Cannonball, was known as the man who could always bring the train in on time. He would blow the whistle, so it started off soft, but it increased to a wail louder than a banshee before dying off. One of his trademarks was his ability to manipulate the steam whistle in the engines he drove. When other railroaders heard the distinctive melodies, got so his people would recognize that whistle and know when Casey Jones was driving past. John Luther Jones was born March 14, 1863, in southeast Missouri. While he was still a small child, the Jones family moved and settled in Casey, Kentucky, where his father found work. This is also where he got his nickname, Casey Jones. The railroad was an integral part of his youth, and John Luther Jones was fascinated with the trains. So, when he was 25 years old, Casey Jones took a job with the Illinois Central Railroad as a fireman. The job meant him moving to the city of Jackson, Tennessee, where he met and fell in love with a local girl named Janie Brady. The two settled in the city, bought a home, and began raising a family. During this time, Casey Jones settled into his job and earned a promotion to engineer. He quickly became one of the most popular engineers on the railroad and was described by those as a colorful character who knew his job inside and out. The popular train he nicknamed the Cannonball Express had a reputation for keeping its timetable. April 29, 1900, Casey brought his train into Memphis, dead on time. Sim Webb worked as the engineer's fireman, stoking the steam-generated coal stove. They became close friends, and both were regarded as one of the railroad line's best teams. Both men looked forward to getting home and catching up on some long overdue sleep. They drove their train to the Poplar Street station and went to check in. There, they discovered a 6-car southbound Cannonball was running 95 minutes behind schedule. Casey also discovered one of the other engineers was sick and unable to make his run, so Casey volunteered to help out his friend. After coupling their locomotive to the 6-passenger cars, Casey Jones and Sim Webb pulled out of the station at 10:50 p.m., an hour and 35 minutes behind schedule. Casey was determined to make up the time. As soon as he could, he highballed out of Memphis. Highballing means to go very fast and taking a lot of risks to get where you're headed, and started making up for lost time. About 4 a.m., when he had nearly made up all the time on the run, Casey rounded a corner near Vaughton, Mississippi, and saw a stalled freight train on the track. Unknown to Jones and Webb, 2 freight cars were being transferred to the side track, as ordered, but having a hard time. During the transfer, one of the trains had ruptured an air hose, forcing the other train to halt, leaving its caboose and 2 other freight cars blocking the main line. 2 flagmen had been dispatched by the railroad to take up position on the track, but the Cannonball Express headed straight on a collision course. Both men knew at once there was no way to completely stop the train. As the train sped toward the caboose, Jones yelled at Sim Webb to jump from the train and save himself. Without thinking for his own safety, Jones immediately stood up, kicked the chair he was sitting in out of the way, and started pulling on the air brakes as hard as he could. The wheels began screaming as Jones tried to bring the 6-car train to a halt. As they approached the stranded cars on the track, Sim Webb got as low as possible on the engine gangway, and at close to 56 miles per hour, leapt from the speeding train. Engine 382, with Casey Jones at the throttle, plowed into the back of the stranded caboose and 2 other cars containing corn and hay, all the time applying the brakes of the speeding train as to minimize the impact on his passengers, and blowing the train's piercing whistle to warn those on the track he couldn't stop. The crunching sound of metal and screaming sounds of the wreck brought people from throughout the small Mississippi area. Webb, who was knocked unconscious from his fall, was brought to the nearby station, where he came around 35 minutes later. The firemen made it out alive, but Casey Jones died in the wreck, one hand on the brake and one on the whistle cord. To everyone's surprise, including the most hardened railroad veterans, Jones's last act had shown unbelievable courage because he had refused to leave his post and save himself. He had prevented his passengers from being killed or even seriously injured. For those who knew how the railroad operated in those days, a different story of the wreck began making the rounds. A blues singer named Wallace Saunders, who worked for many years with the ICR as an engine wiper and knew the colorful Casey Jones, penned a song about the wreck a few days later. The song began working its way across train yards from Tennessee to Maine to California. The song, which was written out of love by the blues singer, became one of America's most popular folk songs of its day. Wallace Saunders never received anything for it except the recognition of having wrote it. Its popularity led it to being incorporated into a vaudeville act in the early 1900s. 9 years later, the song was actually published and rose to become one of America's most popular folk songs, about an icon that could signify the life and times of America's romantic railroad era, Casey Jones.